Increasingly, public procurement policies are being created around the world. Again, in the European Union, all of the countries there are going to have public procurement policies. There are about 18 public procurement policies around the world. When I say public, that's government procurement policies. Because government is responsible, or public procurement is responsible, ranging from about 25 to 40% of all the wood and paper-based consumption that there is in the world. So public procurement policies are important because if you want to have access to those markets, you need to be able to supply sustainably produced paper and paper-based products. That's not just happening now in Europe, it's also happening in places like Japan, and it will also, I understand now there is a public procurement debate going on here in Australia as well. And many more countries will have public procurement policies in future. Then there is, of course, legislation and regulations. The timber regulations, as I mentioned to you, are very, very important because without having a due diligence system in place, you will have difficulty getting access to the markets there. And more countries are developing requirements for legislation and regulation. Even the Chinese government now is looking at providing legality legislation and also developing a public procurement policy. And I'll come back to China in a few minutes. Then there is, of course, the whole issue of private policies. And there are many, many examples of green building councils, for example, your Australian Green Buildings Council. And we had some discussions here yesterday on that. Many retailers are now having procurement guidelines and advice on how one should go about procuring timber and paper-based products. So those are reasons that you should have it because it's a prerequisite or increasingly becoming a prerequisite of doing business. Consumers and customers are increasingly demanding it. And here is a study that was presented at the Planet Arc event. Was it last week? Yes, it was last week, or the week before last, in Sydney. And it shows about prompted awareness from the public of materials. And you can see here that PEFC and FSC are already sitting at 11 to 20%. We're not yet quite up there yet, but we have some aspirations to move higher up. But increasingly, people are becoming aware of it. I am going to quickly show you another slide, which looks at also the awareness of the Australian Forestry Standard. And you can see in this one here, the Australian Forestry Standard is up at 22%. And it's sort of emphasized by the previous study, which shows that if you actually use the word Australia, then in the Australian market, you already have a 15% increase in public awareness of that particular label. From the same study, only 3% of the general public, if unprompted, were able to tell you that there was actually anything out there for wood or paper-based products to deal with sustainability in forestry. Now that may sound alarming, but I would say, we have to bear in mind that these figures change and they change over time. I know that, for example, within Europe, awareness in France and Germany of FSC and PEFC is now up at over 25%. And that has actually doubled within the last 2 years because some major retailers in Germany and France have decided to label all of their products. So suddenly the logo was visible everywhere. So to give you an example as far as paper-based products are concerned, in France there are over 400 million catalogues distributed every single year with the PEFC logo on it and containing products which are then also labeled with PEFC products as well. Increasingly, magazines are showing the label. I did do a code share with Qantas. It was British Airways. They have 3 magazines. 2 of them are published on PEFC certified paper with a label on it, and 1 of them on FSC with a label on it. My son, he's very, very happy now to see that Mickey Mouse is also sustainable. It's actually Donald Duck, but he's very, very happy with that one. So children are beginning to notice these things as well. Okay, my son knows that I do this, but his friends are also saying, look at that, they've seen this logo. It's being used more and more in the construction industry. and also in the packaging industry as well. So we're increasingly seeing logos. I think there are some memory sticks where we have a catalogue of a whole range of products which have been labelled. So if you want to have a closer look at what the whole range of products that there are, even British Parliament, you know, the climate bill and everything else, they were all printed on PEFC certified paper. So the paper is being used much more. Banks are using it for their bank statements, envelopes. The Economist is another magazine that uses it. So it's increasingly being used. So the answer to your question, why certify, is because it is increasingly becoming important. It's not a trend. It's not a fashion which is just going to disappear. It's part of a trend on increasingly being able to demonstrate your sustainability and your impact on sustainability. This slide here is getting a little bit old. It's 2007, but I still think it's an important slide to actually bring home some of the messages that are quite important. If you look at the current debate which is taking place, people are concentrating on carbon accounting, carbon taxes, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And this slide shows that actually people's attention span on issues, on single issues, tends to be quite radical for a while, and then it wanes off until the issue becomes important again, because people can usually only deal with 2 to 3 issues at a time. But, I mean, some issues go from nowhere to being the most important. Here's one. In 1996, Greenpeace did a campaign in Europe about GMOs in paper, and suddenly it came from being a non-issue to being the most important issue within 3 months. Yeah? It's then since wavered a little bit and dropped off again. Other issues take much more longer time. For example, health increasingly increased and is on the up all the time. Obviously, situations such as greenhouse gases and climate change and carbon are important. But the overall message here is that sustainability as such, as an issue, is becoming much, much more important. And I do actually remember that when we started PEFC in 1998, we were wondering about whether we should use the word sustainable, because we were based on the intergovernmental processes which define sustainability. So our whole basis was on that definition of sustainability. But we weren't sure at that time whether the public would understand what the word sustainable means. So it's amazing how far people have moved on in the use of terminology. But sustainability is on the increase, and certification is going to become ever increasingly important. So if you're not yet certified, I would encourage you to become certified. So that was the case for certification.